Oops. Let's move that to the side. Hello. Welcome to our Tuesday edition of Bible Babble. That means it is New Testament Tuesday. And I welcome you. Glad you could join us. And as always, on New Testament Tuesday, we are going to learn a little bit more about what is in the New Testament. When we think of the New Testament, quite often we tend to think of the Gospels, the central story of Jesus, which of course would be the most important part. But then there's also the expanded story about the first maybe 70 years or so of the earliest version of the Christian church, what they themselves called the Way back then, that we don't often think about. So that's kind of what we're covering right now. So, we talked about we talked about Saul and his conversion, and we talked about his visit to Jerusalem, where he kind of made peace with the other disciples. They, for the most part, no longer thought that he was, up to something to trick them into being vulnerable and then arresting them all. But maybe they still were a little bit leery of him. So when they caught word that some of the Hellenistic, meaning the Jews who were steeped in Hellenistic culture, the Greek culture, were not happy with Saul and planned to kill him, the disciples sent him away. As we said last week, they said, "Hey, Saul, you're great. You're a good guy. We really appreciate what you're doing for the cause, but you need to get out." So he was sent off to Turkey, what is now known as Turkey, about 600 miles away. And then we're told in Acts 9, it says, "Then the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace and was strengthened. Living in the fear of the Lord and encouraged by the Holy Spirit, it increased in numbers." Which is pretty cool. What exactly did that look like? What did that mean? We're going to talk about that a little bit. First of all, though, it's just interesting to note and makes you wonder how the disciples, not the disciples so much as whoever wrote the book of Acts, traditionally we think of him as Luke, he kind of at least hints that after Saul went away, everything got quiet, everything was cool, and everything was copacetic for a while. And we don't know if that's really was his intent to do that, or if that's just kind of how it's written It's not a carefully carved piece of literature in the way we think of it. So that's just something to kind of keep in your mind. Things were all good, but they were as good as they can be between a group of disciples and a guy who was trying to kill them. So think of it that way. So, Saul leaves, the disciples are hanging in Jerusalem, and then they start to spread out. They start to go out into the surrounding territory more. And one of the disciples was actually an apostle, Peter, the man, the rock. He traveled out into the countryside, and he ended up first in a city named Lydda. Now it's known as Lod or Lod. And one of the people he encountered there was a guy named Aeneas. Aeneas. Now Aeneas, for 8 years, had been paralyzed and he'd been bedridden. It doesn't say what was wrong with him. It doesn't say if it was an accident or if it was an illness. Since it doesn't talk about an accident, it makes you kind of think that maybe he got ill and something went wrong and he was paralyzed by it. We know it wasn't from birth because he was a man and he's only been this way for 8 years. So Peter encounters him in his bed. We can kind of guess that maybe somebody asked Peter to visit. After Peter had been preaching for a while, maybe somebody said, "Hey, Pete, I've got a guy I know who's paralyzed. You think you could stop by?" So Peter came to Aeneas and he said, "Aeneas, Jesus Christ has healed you." What a bold statement that is. Hey, you, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up. Get up. Roll up your mat. You're not paralyzed anymore. You're well. And Aeneas, speaking much about his faith, Aeneas gets up and can now walk, no longer bedridden. And this is, for the people in Lydda and in a nearby town named Sharon probably. They see that and their minds are like, we'd heard about Jesus doing this kind of stuff. We didn't know Peter could do it. And of course, the complicated answer to that is, of course, Peter didn't do it. Peter is doing it because he is doing the work of Jesus Christ and he's doing the work of God, and it's actually God that's healing these people. But regardless, they didn't realize that he had that kind of pull. So he heals Aeneas and he hangs around there a little bit longer. Now, nearby, there is another town called Joppa. Joppa was near the Mediterranean. And there was a disciple there named Tabitha. Now, I want to stop right there for a second. Let that simple sentence fragment sink in. There was a disciple named Tabitha. And just to clear up any confusion, Tabitha did not used to be a guy's name. Tabitha, we're not talking boy named Sue territory here. Tabitha was a woman. And Acts refers to her specifically as a disciple. So this is actually a big deal because this tells us that in the earliest years of this splinter group, that we would call Christians. In the earliest years of their existence, the women who followed the way were considered disciples. And I think that's pretty cool. So there was this disciple named Tabitha. Street name was Dorcas. Dorcas is the Greek version, or what she was called. That was her Greek name. I call it her street name. Many people at this time, in this culture, 2,000 years ago, they would often have a Hebrew name, their family name, and then they would have a name that they went by outside of the family that was easier for all of the foreigners around them to pronounce. So that's why quite often you'll run across that in the New Testament. You see it in the Old, but in the New Testament specifically, where people have two different first names. They have a Hebrew one, then they have a Greek. So, this woman named Tabitha, she was like a model Christian in the sense that she did what Christians should do. She helped the poor. Acts tells us she was always doing good. So she was a really good person. And about the time that Peter was there, Tabitha became sick. She became sick unto death. She passed away. And her family and her loved ones were told they bathed the body, which was part of the tradition. And then they placed her in an upstairs room. Didn't want her, stuff in my eye. Didn't want her on the main floor, but they put her in an upstairs room. Now, Lydda was near Joppa, so when the other disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him. And the 2 men said, "Hey, Peter, we've got this wonderful woman, name of Tabitha. She was always doing good stuff. She was, she believed in Jesus Christ. She was just a really good person, and, she died. So could you come, please?" Why they wanted him to come is not clear. It looks as though the expectation was that he would be able, perhaps, to do something. Or maybe they just wanted him there, to do a nice memorial service or something. It doesn't really say. But Peter goes with them. And when he arrives in Lydda, when he arrives at Tabitha's house, the people that are there take him to the upper room. And when he walks in, it is this scene of grief and great sadness, and the women are standing around crying. The men are, kind of holding back their tears because they want to cry too, but, men don't do that. And the women are showing him the robes and the clothing that Tabitha made while she was with them. And they're showing her, see, she made this for me. She made this for so-and-so. Isn't it beautiful? Didn't she do great work? Wasn't it such a good thing for her to do? And after Peter is exposed to this for a little bit, he sends them all out of the room. He says, that's really great. Good stuff. Thank you. Get out. So they leave the room. Peter gets down on his knees and prays. It would be wonderful. It would be amazing to know what was going through Peter's mind at this point. Did he know what was going to happen? Did he hope what was going to happen? Or was he just praying on her behalf, saying, God, I want you to welcome this person, regardless of what he prayed, regardless of what was in his heart? He suddenly knew what he was supposed to do. He turns to Tabitha and he says, Tabitha, get up. Another bold statement. Tabitha, get up. Hey, dude, I know you're dead, but get up. And sure enough, Tabitha opens her eyes. She sees Peter, and she sits up. No doubt very, very confused. And then Peter takes her by the hand, and he helps her get to her feet. And he calls for all of the believers who were there, especially the widows who had been crying. And he says, hey, look what I got. And presents Tabitha to them. If Aeneas getting up and walking was a mind blower, this is, like a mind nuke going off. Soon it's known all over Joppa. Undoubtedly, because Joppa's a seaport city, undoubtedly it gets spread elsewhere. And many people start believing in the Lord because of it. And Peter stayed in Joppa for some time then. He stayed with a tanner named Simon. And then something else happens that we'll be talking about next time. But this is how the earliest ministry of the disciples, of the apostles, happened. They would go somewhere, they would preach, they would perform miracles. And the point of the miracle was not a marketing thing. It was not to attract attention, although it did. But it was to show the idea of healing, show the idea that through Jesus Christ we are healed, we are completed, we're restored. And we are then capable of having a relationship with God. That's the subtext to all this. But that's what happened at Lydda and Joppa. Big stuff, monumental miracles. And it only got bigger from there. So let's talk next week. In the meantime, have a great evening. Stay healthy, stay safe out there. And we'll be back tomorrow, same time, for Wildcard Wednesday. Who knows what we'll be talking about? Have a good evening.